my lecture is about how politicians make stupid things. And one of the, what does it mean, stupid things? Well, I have a brilliant idea. Okay, for instance, you know, rent is too high, so let's make rent control. That should work, right? A law that you're not allowed to charge more than whatever. So, you know, some people are not economists, and they might really think that this could be a good idea. But okay, but you could still go and try and learn what's the experience about this. And this fantastic, what Roy Geron does is go to the history of economic events. And you could really see that almost any mistake politicians do today, they're not even original. These are mistakes that are already done in the past. And we know that these are mistakes, and you shouldn't try it again, because there's all the good reasons that it will not work again. Okay. What's in common for taxis, eggs, and milk?
They're all regulated industries.
In what sense regulated?
Price.
There's quota.
Price.
Quota.
Quota as well, yeah. So not just price, also quantities. And so taxes is a fantastic, I mean, let's say a few words first about setting a price. Forget about quantities.
Taxes or taxis?
Moniot.
Something like PC.
Yeah, no, not taxes, taxis. So let's have a few words about setting prices. You see, for many people, you could think, okay, you know, when I go on a taxi, what should be the price? And people tend to think, well, I mean, the price should be sort of reasonable, fair, tzodek. In what sense? Well, it should be high enough for the taxi driver to make a decent profit, but not too high so the customer doesn't pay too much, right? But economists don't think like that at all. We think of, well, the price is just a mechanism so that supply meets demand or demand meets supply. And without prices being able to adjust, responding to supply and demand, a market economy cannot work. That's the key thing in a market economy. And what happens if you regulate too many things, you sort of destroy this basic market mechanism that is really magical. You get out of your house, you go to the shops, and you could buy almost anything you want. Who is in charge of that? Who is running the business? No one. The market mechanism, the price mechanism. Guys, you could drink, you could eat, don't talk, okay? You could talk to all of us. No private conversation. That's a huge negative externality. It's inefficient. And economists are obsessed about efficiency. We hate inefficiencies. So having said that, still, because policymakers are not economists, they think, no, we should set prices in many cases. And even worse when they set also quantities. So, and the history of taxes, taxis, not taxes, taxis, is really fascinating because it shows how policymakers just ignore the economic reason. And so in Israel, I mean, that's similar. I'm talking about the medallion in the US. In Israel, it's called, used to be called Mispar Yarok, green number, and now it's Zchut Ziburit. Let's just use medallion, although it's not really a medallion in Israel. So what's the idea? To drive a taxi, you need, first of all, a driving license. Anyone could get a driving, or, well, I mean, there's some rules, but that's not limited. But then to operate a taxi, the taxi needs this medallion, this Zchut Ziburit. You could buy one today. There is a price, I actually looked it up. It's 259 shekels and 1,000 shekels and a few shekels more. But this wasn't the case always, that you could just buy as many as you want from the Ministry of Transportation. In the past, it was the local, like in the 50s and 60s, it was the local municipality, the town. So the mayor had the right to just give these medallions to whoever he or she wanted to, he in most cases. And then there's this trade-off. You give the medallion to a few people, others are upset, they also want it. But then if you give it to more people, those who already have the medallion are upset because there's more competition. And then, so some mayors gave more, some gave less. So taxi drivers from, say, Bat Yam where there's a lot of, just for the example, would drive to Tel Aviv. So then the Tel Aviv drivers are upset. Why are these drivers coming to compete with me in Tel Aviv? So they made a rule that each taxi could only operate locally. There was a band of color around the taxi, different colors for different regions. As a child, I remember it. And then you can think of the inefficiency. A taxi driver takes someone from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, is not allowed to take a client from Tel Aviv back to Jerusalem, has to drive empty. Okay, at some stage they got rid of that and they made it central. And then, but who do you give it to? Nechei Tzahal, people who were injured in the military. Why? Well, why not? You're in Nechei Tzahal, you might as well drive a taxi. What's the logic? Well, it's just an asset because although the government fully controlled it, then there was a secondary market and you could sell the license to other people or rent it out. Let it to other people. What's the price today? Today, you could rent, if you don't own a taxi, the medallion, and you want to drive a taxi, you could pay about 1,200 shekels a month, and you could do it. But there's a private market for that. So, of course, if you're injured in the military and you want to just cash it, you sell it, you get the money, you could rent it, they actually even gave it to widows of deceased military people. And then in the 70s or 80s, there was a huge shortage of taxis in the sense that people who wanted the service cannot get a taxi. There's just not enough. A lot of pressure from the owners of the medallions. They always called themselves taxi drivers, but they're not really it could be that the same person is a driver and the owner. But the reason they want to limit the market is not because of the driving part, it's the ownership part. Because the government created an asset, an artificial asset that is worth a lot. And indeed, as a result of the shortage, the rent went up and the price of a medallion in the market was like a flat, to buy a house, a small flat. So of course, flats in the 70s were not as expensive as today, but still, a lot of money. As a result of that, there was a situation in which people who worked as taxi drivers but did not own the medallion, there was no chance that they would buy the medallion ever. And the socialist government at the time felt that this is wrong. There's injustice here. How could it be that someone drives a taxi and for the rest of his life, saying his because it's typically guys, will not own the taxi? Okay, luckily they didn't employ the same logic to like aeroplanes or ships, but fine. So what did they do? They said, we need to help these drivers. So let's do something for the sake of these drivers who do not own the medallion. What can we do? Here is the brilliant idea they had. Any driver who doesn't own the medallion and will drive a taxi for 8 years will get the medallion for free or for a symbolic price from the state of Israel. Is this good for the drivers or not? It seems maybe it is.
Short term or long term?
Maybe it is. Maybe it's not.
Maybe the cost of renting for 7 years will be much smaller than for 8 years.
Why 7 versus 8?
Because if I own the medallion and somebody wishes to get his 8th year, I may charge extra for that.
Okay, what happened? So the government thought this is a brilliant idea. It will be good for these drivers who don't own the medallion, Alan, and bad for the owners because eventually there will be more medallions out there. Okay, so suppose I tell you, guys, listen, the government has this brilliant new rule. If you rent a house here in Neve Ilan, after 7 years, you get the house for free in Neve Ilan. What do? Would you consider moving to Neve Ilan? Yeah. What will happen to rent in Neve Ilan? Hint. And that's exactly what happened. So what happened was that the rent for a medallion went up. The net present value of the expected return. So basically what the drivers did for 8 years, they worked and took loans so they could survive. Almost anything they made as taxi drivers went to pay for the owner of rent to the owner of the medallion. So who made immediately a lot of money? Those who already had the medallion. Who made immediately a loss? The drivers. So then you could see that actually this was a policy that didn't really help them, just forced them to work hard for nothing for 8 years and then to get the flat. But it's even worse because the price was sort of a bubble. And when they finally started giving the medallions, the bubble exploded. And they were working like slaves for 8 years, but then instead of getting a flat, they got half of a flat. So you see, it was a good intentioned policy, good or bad, no matter of taste, but they really did a lot of damage to exactly the people they wanted to help, and they helped a lot the people they didn't want to help. Where were the economists? How come they make such a decision? Where were all they? No, they just didn't ask anyone, because they had, it's a brilliant idea, let's just do it. Just as background, I have to update this slide, but it really doesn't matter. Just if you ask me what's the situation of the state of Israel, let's ignore the last year and a half, okay? Maybe even ignore COVID and the war and everything. Generally speaking, let's look at the last 20 years, excluding the last 4 years. What could I say? If I need to summarize the situation of the Israeli economy in 2 or 3 sentences, I would say what's interesting about the Israeli economy is the following. On the macro, we're doing extremely well. Very high growth rates, much above the average of the OECD countries. But on the micro, things don't look as good because there's high problems of income inequality. In fact, inequality is increasing and the social budgets are decreasing per capita. So good on the macro, bad on the micro. Does this sound reasonable to you? Yeah, completely wrong. Everything I said now is opposite to the facts, okay? So how come you agree with me? Because that's what you read in the newspapers, that's what you read in the radio, on TV, that's what you hear politicians say. Who has the interest to mislead you? In many cases, journalists are just lazy. So a politician says something, they just repeat it. Growth rates. Why do we care about economic growth? Why is this even interesting? Well, because we care about the quality of living, and we have more economic growth, higher income per capita, So, that's more money, not formally speaking. So you could live better. So if we have more growth, income per capita goes up, the quality of living goes up. So if we care about people, then that's a good thing. So what does matter here? Is it growth of GDP or GDP per capita? Per capita, right? So for instance, if in a given year, total GDP, gross domestic product, the output is just the economic value measured in prices of the total goods and services produced in the economy in a year. That's GDP, gross domestic product, okay? So if in a given year, suppose that GDP growth, the total output we produce, the value of the total output grows by 2%, no inflation, okay, so it really grows in real terms by 2%, but population growth is also 2%. Could we say that something positive happened in per capita terms to the quality of living? No, right? Okay, so that's the big lie of those who always the government wants to tell you stories about how great they are. What's an important difference related exactly to that point between Israel and all the other OECD countries? Population growth. In Israel, the population is growing by 2% every year. So if total output growth here is 4%, in per capita growth, it's only 2%. So 4% is very high if we look at 15 years compared to the OECD countries. But once you correct for population growth, then we're doing reasonably well. a bit more than the average, but not extremely well, as Netanyahu used to tell us many times, maybe still does, and every time whoever was the Minister of Finance. Okay, so of course there are many people who want to criticize Netanyahu, but instead of just telling the public this simple truth, this is not economic growth, this is growth in total GDP, not in per capita terms, and there is also the adjustment to purchasing power, but let's put that aside. Why don't they just say, no, that's wrong, because they don't understand it's wrong? Okay, what's the education of most reporters on economic issues in Israel? Did they study economics? No, they didn't. One senior reporter told me, no, seriously, we cannot hire these guys. We have to hire graduates of theater because, because we cannot pay economists. So they don't know economics, so they report whatever they hear or understand without the necessary knowledge. Right. So how do I criticize Netanyahu? Let's write that inequality is increasing. Yeah, but it's not. You look at the data, it's more or less since 2004 or 5, we see a decline in income inequality in Israel, okay? In fact, you could credit Netanyahu for that, because when he was Minister of Finance, and we were in 2002 in the crisis, economic crisis here, he cut a lot of these budgets that go just allowances, kitzbaot, and pushed people to the labor force. And eventually that reduced inequality. So you see, you get a completely wrong picture of the Israeli economy if you don't listen to real economists or go into reading the details. If you just listen to the news on the radio, you get a completely misleading information. Now, why is that important? Here is the data, by the way.
Where are they getting their information?
Who?
Those who are giving misleading information in the media,
They just, you know, they hear Netanyahu say something, they write it. They hear the opposition say something, they write it. You know, sometimes they read reports, but you know, they don't have the time. Most of them, some are okay, but the majority, they don't have the time to really look into the details. I'll show you more examples. But this is a income per capita growth, Israel compared to the average OECD. So you could see actually in 2009, the crisis, we're doing pretty well, but then we're sort of more or less like everyone else, like the average. It's okay, it's fine, it's not bad, but it's not extremely well compared to the average as the idea that you had, which is just completely wrong. What about inequality? Okay, this is what happened in 10 years, 2009 to 2018. The lower 10%, asiron tachton, real growth in income, in real terms, asiron elyon. So you see, you had this idea that, oh yeah, it's just the top 10% earners, those who work in the high-tech industry, yeah, they make tons of money, and it's הקטר משאיר את הקרונות מאחור. The engine leaves the train behind.
Is it only labor income?
Income, total income. And you see that the facts just go completely against these wrong ideas that you had in mind. By the way, if I look at someone, the average person who was at the lowest 10% in 2009, in real terms, by how much the income of this person grew over this period?
59%. Not really. Actually.
59%, more or less?
Much less because...
No, wrong. Real terms. This is real terms.
Oh, real terms. More.
Why more?
Yeah.
No, in real terms. Purchasing power. Real terms. Okay? If I translate income to bundles of consumption, it grew up by 59. Guys, people don't permanently live in the lowest income. People move. There's mobility. And from being at the lowest group, you can only move up. So on average, a person that was here, the average person that was here in 2009, today makes more than 59 higher. And by the way, the opposite is true for the top 10%. So even the picture is even more nicer in terms of reducing inequality.
Could you also address the minimum wage and how it affects?
No. Guys, let's do the following thing. Every question you ask, if I answer, there is an alternative cost, which is very high, which means I need to cut short the lecture. So trust me, I know what are the topics that I have added value for you. I could talk about a lot of things. I'm happy to answer outside this lecture any question, but there is a huge cost. Yeah.
Is it before or after taxation?
Net, after taxation.
And after transfers.
What do you
So
mean by income? What do you mean by income? Earned income or just like
All income. Guys, it doesn't, the details don't matter really. The details don't matter.
It might be assets.
No, it's income. Income from all sources. Most people in Israel don't have many income from assets, especially not in the lower groups.
What about government programs? Income from government programs?
Yeah, this is in. Yeah. The government transfers are definitely in. Yeah. Okay. So let's see how all that is related to politicians and the public. Why do they make, what drives politicians to make decisions? So part of it could be ideology, could be. But I think that, okay, I'm not used to this set of slides. Okay, so for a politician to make decisions, an important thing is to survive in politics, okay? So they need to be re-elected. So what do they need to do? Need to do stuff that the public, or at least their voters, like. And sometimes the voters have completely wrong ideas. As I just showed you, you have very wrong ideas about the Israeli economy. And if politicians always tell you, guys, look, we should offer free of charge, chinuch chinam, education from the age of 0, not just from the age of 4 or whatever. Remember all the ads from 0. Netanyahu promised free education from the age of 0. Okay, and everyone is enthusiastic about that, especially young couples, because they have children at the relevant age and it's expensive. So they think, yeah, that's a great idea. And, I tell them, where does the money come from? Okay, right? Who would pay for that? Does the government just have this magical source of income? And the only reason so far they don't give you free education is because they're just evil or mean? Do you remember the discussion around COVID? How generous is the government? Is it cheap, kamtsanit, or nediva? Remember this discussion, right? That's just a stupid discussion, right? Suppose I could force Bob to give Josh money, as much as I say, Bob, give Josh 1 shekel. Then you'll tell me, Omer, you're so cheap. So, okay, fine, Josh, give him 10,000 shekels. Am I generous now? That's exactly the government. Netanyahu doesn't bring money from home to give you. Okay, when he gives money, especially Netanyahu not, right? when he gives money, like COVID, the allowances, the money they gave us to encourage the economy to work, and Josh talked with you this morning about these Keynesian misleading ideas. But anyway, it's not about generosity. You could have reasonable policy, which gives money for some things, or unreasonable policy. It's nothing to do with generosity or being cheap, okay? So what did I want to write here? Yeah, that would be my objective for policy. When we talk about the policy debate, that would be my objective. The welfare of people, with an emphasis on those who are at the lower end of the distribution. Does that sound reasonable to you? No, this time it's not a trick question. You're already looking at me, oh, where's the trick? No trick this time. Okay, so what would I do? Now, before that, I actually wanted to give you an example of populism. So if politicians want to do what the public want, then they might do stuff that they even understand is bad. And let's again, I mentioned Netanyahu a few times. Don't worry, I will also attack today a lot from the other side of the political division. In 2009, remember when the economy was doing fantastic? Yeah, here. What happened here? That's when Netanyahu starts his last regime, replacing Ehud Olmert as prime minister. Netanyahu nominates Yuval Steinitz to be the minister of finance. Yuval Steinitz has a PhD, but in philosophy, not in economics. And he, at that point of time, realized that he actually doesn't know much about economics, and he needs someone to help him. So he comes to me, and for 1 year, I was his senior economic advisor in the Ministry of Finance. Why only 1 year? Because after half a year, Steinitz thought that just between us, yeah, he thought that because he's a philosopher, he actually has the fundamental understanding and he knows economics better than economists. Okay, typical to a lot of people. And okay, so that was April. A month or two later, we have a meeting with him, just Steinitz and his the close advisors, so myself and 2 or 3 political advisors. And he tells us, look, we're in a crisis. And Netanyahu told me that a crisis is an opportunity to make reforms that are unpopular, because you cannot, in normal times, you cannot just pass these reforms in the public. Okay, what's the first thing that Netanyahu told Steinitz to do? In Israel, VAT, ma'am, on fruit and vegetable is 0. And Netanyahu told Steinitz, just cancel this. The VAT on fruit and vegetable should be 17% or whatever it was at the time, like anything else. Steinitz asks my opinion and said, yeah, I agree with Netanyahu. The different VAT rates on different goods is a bad thing for many reasons. The main thing is, as I told you before already, the fallacy that the government could be generous. So if the government gives you a tax cut on something, it has to take the money from a different place. And again, I think Josh talked about it this morning, that when the government spends money to encourage the economy, to stimulate the economy, if people are not stupid, they understand that this money, they will have to pay it back. Okay, the Ricardo equivalence. We did talk about it today. So same thing is here. But people don't understand it. So I told him, yes, do what Netanyahu told you. I think that the different VAT rates is a horrible thing, because every time, once you have it, all the time there is pressure to have VAT cuts on different things. So people say, oh, on medicine. And others say, remember, Lapid, we have actually some guy here who resigned his job at the Ministry of Finance exactly because of that, right? Yes. Because Lapid was pushing for VAT 0 on housing. And Michael Sarel said, I cannot serve under this minister. Well done, Michael. And so you see, once you start with it, it's very hard to put an end to it. But then the political advisors told Steinitz, no, don't do it, you know. With all due respect to Professor Moav, the public doesn't think like him, they will just hate you. Why do you need it? And he said, well, you know, I'm going to be a minister of finance for 4 years. I'm going to do a good job, so I don't care. If they initially don't like me, at the end they will love me. And plus Netanyahu wants it, so of course I'll do it. So to make a long story short, what's VAT on fruit and vegetable today? 0. So we completely failed, right? Why? Why? Was it governance, meshilut, the courts, maybe the court. That's why we needed the reform. The Supreme Court said you're not allowed to do it. Was that the reason? No. Who blocked it? Netanyahu himself. A day before the vote in Vadat HaKsafim, Appropriation Committee, Netanyahu, who read the views of the public, just said, okay, I'm canceling. I see that you don't like it. Was no reason to do what he did. He understood very well that this is an important reform. There was no coalition crisis. He could have just let it go. But he wanted to be popular, and he destroyed this modest move. And of course, once he destroyed this, we were unable to do anything else that is unpopular, because we understood that he's not going to help. Okay, so let's talk about, so suppose, I'm criticizing all the world and everyone, but suppose I was the Minister of Finance or the Prime Minister, what would I do? Or better, just a benevolent dictator that could actually do what he wants to do. I'll start with an objective. There's no reason to talk about policy without an objective. A policy is the mean. What's the goal? Well, the objective, so here it is. I think it's a cool one. It's good. Okay, what I didn't write here, so you seem to agree with me that that's sort of a good idea. Notice that I didn't write reducing inequality. I wrote put the emphasis on those who are poor, so help them. So that sort of seems as if I'm saying reduce inequality. Well, I'm sort of am saying it. But why then I say I don't want to add and reduce inequality? Because that's one way to reduce inequality. Another way is chop the heads of those who are successful. That's a bad idea, morally and economically. What I want, but then you see still the public debate is all about inequality is bad, you should reduce inequality. My contribution to this debate is that I think we should distinguish between various sources of inequality. Okay, in Hebrew we say lirot bracha ba'amal. Do you think it's a good, how would you translate this? Bracha ba'amalo? Yeah, to see blessing from your effort. Yeah, it's a biblical, is it a biblical term? Yeah, bracha ba'amalo. So yeah, everyone thinks that's a good idea. That if you work hard, that's okay if you're rewarded for it. Okay, so if a worker works hard, wants to be promoted. You start your own business. You take risks, you borrow, you work hard, it's successful. Makes sense that you're rewarded. In a different system, like suppose the kibbutz, where it doesn't matter what you do, the income is identical to everyone. That was a great success. Not really, because as a matter of fact, more than 80% of kibbutzim today are not kibbutzim anymore. They still call themselves kibbutzim, but they're not anymore, and the equal pay is gone. Okay? Because that's sort of a problem if there's no incentives. So if you agree with me that it's good that people see blessing in their efforts, then you agree with me that inequality is a good thing, not a bad thing. People who work differently or are successful in different ways, they have different income. The point is that if instead I tell you, okay, so if inequality is good, so I have the following law to propose. Anyone that his last name starts with Aleph to Mem gets every month another 1,000 shekels. Everyone with a last name from Nun to Taf gets less 1,000 shekels. That creates inequality. That's great. Is that great? You're not allowed to change your last name. Yeah? That's a bad idea, right? Why is that a bad idea? Because it's unrelated to merit. It's not related to what you did. It's just completely random. So I want you to think about income inequality as part of it a result of merit. I mean, of course, some of it is just luck. But part of it is a result of this market economy in which prices, including wages, is this demand-supply story. And if someone is more successful or studied, has a profession that is in a higher demand, that makes sense that this person, I mean, I'm not saying from a moral point of view, from an economic point of view. I also think from a moral point of view, but my emphasis is economics. But, just to randomly give people different wages, or in a way that's not random, but is unrelated to anything of amal, bracha ba'amal, That doesn't make much sense, but you see that the system in Israel, like in many other countries, is full of that stuff. For instance, in the Israeli public sector, what's the main source of differences in income between different groups? Give me two main sources of difference. Vetek, so many, how tenure, how many years you hold the job. Why is that reasonable? I would say that's completely unreasonable. Okay? Think, for instance, let's go to a place I know very well. I used to work at the Hebrew University, the public sector of universities. The wages in Israel, unlike the US, are just set. Doesn't matter if you're successful, you're not, if you're in a high demand field or not, all the same. Of course, success does affect because promotion affects. And then if you publish well, you're promoted a bit sooner, but doesn't matter. You could be a star in economics or finance, or a mediocre in philosophy, a star in a good university, a mediocre in a bad university. Still, the wages would be the same. But there would be a huge difference. So think of a lecturer. She's 35 years old. She has 2 children, young children, and she's in the early stages of her career. She works really hard. She's very successful. And then think of this full professor about to retire, doesn't do any work at all, comes to the class, mumbles something, and makes twice as much as the young lecturer. Okay, I'll say, from my point of view, if salaries should be merit-based, then it should be the opposite. The young, successful person, not because of being young, just because of being successful and productive, should make more than this old guy. You'll tell me, yeah, but you're this capitalist, you're extreme, we're socialists. So there's nothing socialist in giving this guy more. Actually, socialism goes about needs. Okay, he's already finished paying the mashkanta, the mortgage, doesn't have any kids at home, this makes a lot of money and lives very comfortably. And the young lecturer, she actually has to pay the mortgage, and she has young kids at home. She needs much more money. Okay, so it's not socialism, it's not capitalism, just corruption of labor unions. That's it. That's the only reason. In 2007, we went out on a huge strike. I don't know if you guys remember that. No, you probably don't. Too young. And every day we got this report from our union, all the universities, all the public universities. This happened today, and then a lot of details. Then one day, the strike is over. We are going to receive an average of 24% raise, which is a lot of money, without any details. So I started investigating what's going on. What did I learn? The young researchers who, to start with, had a very low salary compared to the average, got a raise of 19%. The full professors that already had much higher salaries got a raise of up to 30%. Why? Because they could. That's it. They were the guys who represented us. And they could, and that's what they did. Let's not get there. Let's not get there. Well, but that's experience. You could measure the output. I don't care about experience. No employer would pay you just because you're experienced if it doesn't translate to productivity. Okay, experience is an input, is not directly productivity. So you could use, as I told you a story, right? The story is, yeah, this guy is very experienced, but so what? Doesn't do any research, doesn't bother to teach well. What does it help? Okay, again, I'm doing a shortcut here. Okay, so what do I do in order to to achieve my goals? The list would be short. Why? Because I just want to focus on things that are not in consensus. Because if I tell you here, we need to improve the public transportation system. Who is against that? Almost everyone is in favor. So not interesting. It's like, mi be'ad migur terror. Who is against putting an end to terror? Yeah, everyone is. Who is in favor? Everyone is in favor. So that's not really interesting. So let's go to the interesting thing. Free competitive market economy, starting with free international trade, so to allow imports. Flexible labor market, which means no tenure in the public sector. Private schools, you could think of that with public finance, the voucher system. We also talked about this morning. I looked at the slides, that's why I know. Privatization, generally speaking, anything that the private sector could do better, like trains, for instance, maybe, then privatize it. Reduce regulation in public transportation. In Israel, you know that you cannot. Suppose you have this brilliant idea. I recognize the need. People are happy to pay to go from point A to B. I'll just start my own business, shuttle that takes people from point A to B. And I'll not ask the government for any subsidy. I'll just charge whatever people are willing to pay. Illegal in Israel. You are not allowed to provide any public transportation service in Israel. It's fully regulated by the government, not just taxis, everything.
What is the definition of public transportation?
In Israel or generally? תחבורה ציבורית.
It's serving the public, but it's not owned by.
It's owned by, well,
It's regulated by the government, it's not owned by the government.
Initiative.
no, public transportation is also, covers also privately provided, just open for the public. That's what I mean.
Transportation usually is the term.
Mass or whatever, yeah, just open to serve the public. Protection. So you see, generally, you see the spirit of things. Let me just say something about trade. So when the state of Israel was established in 48, there was just, the government controlled everything, and you're not allowed to import anything without a license from the government. The government controlled the exchange rate. There were many different exchange rates. And there was a shortage of foreign currency in Israel. So that's sort of the justification. Things got much better in 1953 with the agreement with the Germans. They sent a lot of money to Israel, הסכם השילומים. But still, there's a lot of pressure all the time from the Israeli industry and farming. Don't allow imports because that's a competition we cannot handle. And of course, the idea is very simple, that if you allow for imports, that would destroy jobs. So that's sort of the sense of imports are bad for the economy, exports are good. I'll talk about that in more detail. Just want to tell you that in the 90s, who was prime minister? Rabin, from the so-called left. It was a huge opening for imports, and a lot of things that in the 80s we were not dreaming to buy, like decent running shoes. Okay, it was Hamegaper, and then when Gali started, this was like really exciting. Nike, Adidas, no. You need to go abroad or to be very rich to buy these shoes. Textiles, electronics, wood, and so on. So, of course, as a result of just opening for imports a lot of things, not everything, a lot of things, a lot of jobs were destroyed, and there was huge unemployment. Because, well, no, there was not. But in addition, not just that there was not huge unemployment, what else happened in the 90s? We got the immigrants from the former Soviet Union. 1 million people come to Israel, the local population 5 million. So a huge increase in the population. These people come with very little capital, so they don't create jobs, they want to work. So you have more supply of workers who want to work, and on the other hand side, you have these imports that destroy jobs. And still, you don't get an increase in unemployment. How is that? Well, we'll talk about that later. But for now, I have a question for you. Really important?
Just it's also independency, not only jobs. Why you don't want to import stuff?
Let's not get there. Yeah, so, okay. I will get there. You mean like עצמאות במזון. You don't want to trust the world to feed you because one day they will say no and we'll be hungry.
It already happens. I mean, you don't have wheat, you import a lot of stuff.
Yeah, so we cannot produce our own food. It's impossible. And all the farmers who tell you this, they're just...
Populists.
I don't want to use the word that's on my mouth. Think of a chicken, for instance, right? Remember, it's all about all these things about all the debates we had about eggs. No, you cannot import eggs to Israel. We need to be independent. We need to produce our own food. What happens if the world doesn't allow us to import eggs? So first of all, remember, so we tell them, okay, so let's produce more eggs in Israel. No. No, we want to keep the quota. Okay, so that's the first thing where they lie. Is there a shortage of eggs in Israel? Sometimes there is. What's the other lie? What's a chicken? You know, putting aside the fact that it's a miserable animal. From a point of view of an economist, it's a machine. You put grain in one side, and egg comes out from the other side. It's a machine. Where does the grain come from? You import. So, you know, just don't give me this nonsense. Don't. Remember the marginal cost of, you know, going into these corners. I have an answer to everything, but I don't want to go there. Okay. If you need to give a title to this list, would it be capitalism or social democracy? Okay, let's play a game. I'll say a word, a term, and just give me the first person an Israeli person that comes to mind. Social democracy. Sheli Yachimovich, Merav Michaeli. Cool. Let's do it again. I'll say a term, countries, without thinking. Social democracies. Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Germany. All right. So, why is that important? So Sheli Yachimovich used to be the number one answer. Actually, I had top 3 answers used to be Sheli Yachimovich and Sheli Yachimovich. And then, of course, Merav Michaeli, Tamar Zandberg, and many. Actually, almost everyone in the so-called left in Israel likes to call themselves, we're social democrats. Economic policies on the right, typically identical, but they don't like the term social democrats. But that's the only difference, is just words. And then you see why this is an important game I'm playing with you, these associations. Because what did I learn from that? That in your eyes, like the general Israeli public, if I want to be like Sweden, I should ask Sheli Yachimovich, what should I do? Okay, that's the link. I tell you social democracy, Sheli Yachimovich, Sweden. Okay, so let's bring Sheli Yachimovich here and ask her what does she think of what Omer Moav suggests. And she'll you, oh, no, that's completely against my views. She's against free trade. She says, I know that it could reduce the cost of living, but I'm in favor of the worker, not the consumer, as if it's two different people. Anyway, but that's her rationale. Of course, she's against free markets. No workers should be tenured. You're not allowed to fire anyone. Private, God forbid, private schools, even with public finance, privatization. If I say, let's privatize the train, she say, oh, you're an extreme capitalist. That's completely against the social democratic way, and so on and so forth. But now let's go to Sweden and Denmark and see what they did. Yeah, free trade? Yes, they like the idea of free trade. Why? Because it's good for the population. It improves the quality of living. What about flexible labor market? In Denmark, they canceled tenure in the public sector. I'll show you that also in Sweden, they're happy to fire workers who are not productive. Look, if you agreed with me that we prefer to live in a country in which people have a better life, more welfare, their life is better, they're wealthier, they're richer. That means you have to agree with me that we would like to live in a country that most people contribute to the welfare and not just steal money from others. Okay, and tenure, what does it mean? You don't fire a worker just because, even if you want to, because this worker is not productive anymore. And the public sector in Israel is full of these type of workers. Think, what's the job of a school in Israel? Why do we have schools? What's the goal number 1? I'll tell you, employment. How do I know? Well, because if I go to a school and there is a teacher that is, you know, just damaging the kids. If the manager, principal cannot fire this teacher, then what's the goal? The kids or the teacher? It seems to me like the teacher. Okay, let's move on. Private schools, actually in Sweden, this is very popular, the voucher system. Private schools with public finance. Privatization, as a matter of fact, a lot, not all, but large parts of the public transportation in Sweden and Denmark were privatized. So again, against the Shelley Yachimowicz approach, and more and more. So you see the idea. In fact, the idea, this is an important way that you're misled by politicians and by the media in Israel, is to give you the idea that to have the Swedish quality of life, whether you like it or not, you have to follow these, what these guys call themselves social democrats, but they are not really, just all sort of socialism. So I would say that capitalism is actually not in contradiction to a welfare state, is a necessary condition. And this is something the Swedish and the Danish understand very well. You need, how do you make, what's the key, what's the system? How do you make a welfare state? You start by producing a lot, high GDP per capita. Then you could tax it. You could tax it heavily if this is what you want. But you cannot tax heavily in India. You need to start with high output. Then you could tax it heavily. And then you could redistribute the tax revenue, give more education, health, public transport, whatever you want. Help the poor, and so on and so forth. You cannot start with a poor economy. And to make a wealthy economy, there's only one system that works, a market economy. I'm not telling you this based on some theory, just looking at reality. There's not a single example in history of an economy that is not based on markets, that is based on mainly initiative and private entrepreneurs, not the state, private property, protection of property rights, and competition. Give me one example that without these basic fundamentals of a market economy, we had success. There's not a single case.
What would you say about Israel in its early days?
It was market economy, with a lot of damage from the government that tried to intervene, but was a market economy. Not market economy, the Soviet Union. Huge success. Okay, why can't we actually be Sweden? So forget about Shelley Yachimowicz. Let's go to Sweden and learn from them. What's their secret? So bad news, we cannot. And here is the story based on Kohelet's data. Okay, so it's not data from Smolanim. Data shel Anshe Yamin. Okay? That's the data. So maybe it's updated and the numbers are a bit different, but that's an older version I have. What do you see here? I'm looking here at, well, it says Jews, but it's not really Jews. It's everyone that is not ultra-Orthodox or Arab. Okay? Mainly Jews, but not just. And we look at the deciles of income. The poorest, on average, receive from the state of Israel in education, in health, and transfers, and a few other things, about 5,700 shekels a month per family. The richest 10% pay taxes 17,730 shekels a month, more than what they get in transfers, education, health, public transport. I don't think that public transport is in this version. Okay, what happens with the Arabs? The picture looks very different. 20% of the Israeli population, you see, they are more on the receiving side. Okay, what about the ultra-Orthodox? About 12, 13% of the population. Looks pretty bad. Okay, so on average, an ultra-Orthodox family costs us a lot of money every month. Now, that's okay. They're only 12% of the population. Exactly, exactly. So you see, the important difference between the Arabs and the ultra-Orthodox is that they're stable. Fertility rates among Arabs is even slightly less than the Jewish population today. Okay, slightly less, mainly because we also have the ultra-Orthodox. So they're growing rapidly. You don't need to envision the future. Today, a quarter of the children in Israel were born to ultra-Orthodox families. Okay, so that's a challenge. They have a lot of children. They don't get proper education. And they don't work as much. The women do. The men, only half of them work. So we cannot be. That's non-sustainable. That's non-sustainable. We cannot continue like that. It will explode at some point. It cannot continue working like that. Something will happen. Will we envision, will we have a government that would say, look, this cannot continue. We need to do something before there is a disaster, or will the disaster hit us? I'm afraid the latter. Yeah. Yeah. משפחות, זה משקי בית, משפחות. Households.
למה המדינה עשתה את זה מלכתחילה?
Conditions.
That's interesting. Do you think, well, that's, Netanyahu 20 years ago understood. Look what he says in an interview in English. The ultra-Orthodox brought many, many children that the private sector had to finance. When was that? A year ago, not 20 years ago, a year ago. This weird guy, Jordan Peterson. So in English, sometimes he forgets to lie and says what he really thinks. The ultra-Orthodox gave him a very hard time on that interview. He was already part of his coalition. Now, the recent government, and that's what he really thinks. He understands the problem. But what does he do? Just gives them more money.
הבעיה זה רק פריון, כי עבודה 75% עובדים.
הבעיה היא they work, only half, the men, no, not 75% of the men. Generally, yes, but it's very low labor force participation of men, high fertility rates, and low earning ability, low earning capacity, because they don't study. So they make very little money. So they are poor, and we need to support them. Everyone is suffering from that. But their leaders have an interest that they stay like that. Okay? A lot of the jobs, that's correct. A lot of the jobs are public sector jobs and that are just created to support them. A lot of the women today, many start to go out of these jobs and make higher income, but still. So that's a problem we have. Taxes in Israel, by the way, I mean, there's always this claim that the tax system is not sufficiently progressive, but actually you could see that, let's skip that. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Sweden. Okay, I was a lecturer, John Hassler is actually a friend and is an important guy because he's in the Nobel Committee, so you should be nice to him. John Hassler, he visited Israel, and I sleep well at night because I know I'm doing okay as a professional economist, but I'm not in the short list or long list for the Nobel. I always feel sorry for the guys that think they're about to get it and they probably don't sleep well at night, right? So I'm not worried about that. So, okay, the story of Sweden. Interesting, because after a century, from the middle of the 19th century until 1970, they had the fastest growth rate in income per capita in the world. But then a slowdown started. Actually, Sweden was ahead of the world in terms of a small, efficient government and free trade and free movement of people. They were really ahead of the world. But the slowdown started. Economists at least argue that the regulation was too heavy, marginal taxes were very high. In fact, the marginal tax on labor income was 90%. Could you imagine? 90%. So someone offers you, Omer, come give a lecture. I'll pay you 1,000 shekels. For 100 shekels, I'm not getting out of my bed.
60s and 70s in the US, I think also it was crazy. 70% marginal tax.
Yes.
Dysfunctional wage setting. So the system was actually, I forgot to say that. When we talked about the public sector in Israel, so we mentioned tenure. What else? What else? If I look at the general public sector in Israel, huge differences in income across different workers. In the public sector, what explains it? Eskem kibbutzi, everyone has eskem kibbutzi. Education, everyone. Vadei Ovdim, they're all unionized.
This system versus the civil system?
It's related to unions. What's the key? Why? Yeah, the power of the union. Who gets high pay? Those who could damage a lot. If you could go on a strike and everyone suffers, you're paid very well. But if you go on a strike and no one cares, even if your work is almost no one cares, like if you're a social worker, you know, it's a hard job, it's important, but the general public, the government doesn't really suffer if you go on strike. But if you work in the electric company or in the airport, you go on strike, everyone suffers. So that translates to wages. I hope no one thinks that's a good system. The Swedish managed to, I'll get to there soon. They also had this type of problems, high inflation, unsustainable fiscal policy. Success breeds stupidity. So they were so successful that they said, oh, we're so rich, now we need to give people more. But when you give too much, the system collapses, and that's what happened to them. So they do the reform, so it was a complete makeover, quite similar to what happened in Israel in '85. This was in 1990, I think. A new tax system, you see they cut taxes heavily, reduced the marginal tax rate to 50%, and VAT became uniform. It's not just some crazy, it's a consensus, I think, among economists that VAT should be uniform. New agreement on wage setting, export industry leading. So here's the idea that they have there. They negotiate and they decide how much they could raise wages without destroying the competitiveness of the exporting sector. And everyone else gets the same, not more. Okay, so very different than the Israeli system. Large privatizations, rail, taxes, schools, post, electricity. So yeah, privatization doesn't go against social democracy. The idea there, you see, in Israel, we like have an ideology. We have people like Yechimovich that think that, no, it's a matter of ideology. The state needs to provide these goods, not the private sector. Some people have the opposite ideology. My view, you know, whatever works. So if you tell me that in this industry it's better to have a private provider, fine, if that's what works. And if in some industries the opposite is true, a public provider, the government, fine. You know, the goal is the service, the welfare, not the mean is the mean. It's not the goal. And that's what happened. So that's GDP per capita in Sweden in comparison to the average OECD. Okay, so it went down in comparison to the average, not an absolute decline. So from 25% above the average to the average almost, reform, success. Go back to faster growth rates than the average. Okay, right, bananas. You ask, why do I show you bananas? So I spend half of my time in England, and well, you know, England is boring. What can I do? I take pictures of bananas. That's my hobby. And you see the date goes back to 10 years ago, and you could see the price. That's the important thing. And if you think of the exchange rate, you'll see that bananas are about 4 shekels a kilo. In Israel, it's much more, right? So, and these are fantastic bananas, to my taste. And the reason I'm emphasizing this, 1 second, true story. I gave this lecture in Ben Gurion University. And I said, these are fantastic bananas, better than the bananas in Israel. This guy raises his hand and says, no, you're wrong. I said, what do you mean? It's a matter of taste. No, his father did his PhD on the bananas and found that the Israeli banana is somehow healthier or something like that. Okay, a year later, I'm in Tel Aviv, giving the same lecture, again, the bananas, again I say and the bananas are really good. The same guy, I told you already that you're wrong. Yes?
I just wanted to add a deeper way through bananas. So they're supposed to be like butter to
Exactly. Well spotted. Waitrose. That's not a cheap place. That's the expensive chain. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so why are, let me show you my entire collection. That's it. I think that's where I got tired of this hobby and I started running or something like that. You could also buy blueberries, which are, that's more expensive, but still much cheaper than Israel. By the way, people talk about needs. I was a kibbutz member for many years. In a kibbutz, you don't want anything. You need or you don't need. And but I could tell you, what do you mean? When I'm in England, I really need blueberries. When in Israel, I don't need blueberries. I see the price, this need vanishes. Okay, so yeah.
But that's a matter of climate, right? To raise this in the Israeli climate is
You could import, but let's look.
That's
I'm getting there. Imports. Let's talk about that. But just a minute before that. So why are bananas in England cheaper? Where do they grow the English bananas?
in Spain.
Actually, you could see it says somewhere. Colombia, but not just in Latin America and in Africa. So the English, the UK, they understand that they're not really good at growing bananas, so they say, well, let's do what we're good at and buy bananas. In Israel, in contrast, we're not very good at growing banana, but we still do it. So how do banana farmers make money? We block competition. So you're not allowed to import bananas to Israel. And yeah, that's why we pay a lot of money for bananas. But you might say, well, that's for a good reason, because for each of us, that's small money. But for 1,000 families in Israel, I'm just making up a number, this is the source of livelihood. So maybe we should be happy to pay a few shekels every month and let these people have a living. Answer, it's just a loss for us and no gain for them in the long run. How do I know there's no gain for banana growers from this restriction? Because there's no restriction. Unlike taxes or eggs, anyone could grow a banana in Israel. And you could see fields. So of course, competition reduces profits on the banana industry like anything else. And indeed, when you look at drive in Israel or take the bus, whatever, and you could see that in the same places they grow bananas, they also grow other stuff. So if bananas were more profitable, then why do they grow grapes near the bananas? Because the profits on the margin is more or less the same, because that's what you'd expect would happen. So the end result is that the farmers don't really benefit from it, but we lose. So more generally, the policy in Israel, you see, that's again, it's a quote from Yechimovich when Steinitz wanted to open the markets for imports of dairy products. The opposite you should do. Not open to imports, but helping and encouraging and subsidizing exports. That's what you should do. Okay, what's the logic behind that? Well, the way you were raised in Israel is to think that exports are good, imports are bad. Why? Because if you export, first of all, you gain dollars, you get money. That's great. And then you create jobs, because to export something, you need to produce it, so you need to employ workers. And exactly for that reason, imports are bad, because they destroy jobs and they waste dollars. Okay? I'll offer you an alternative logic. It's also stupid, but it's an alternative. Imports are great, exports are bad. What's an export? You produce something, you put resources, effort, you produce something, but instead of consuming it, enjoying it, you send it for someone else to enjoy. Imports are fantastic. Someone else works and we enjoy it. What's wrong with this argument? Well, I'll tell you. The wrong thing is to look at these two things as separate, exports and imports, but they're actually two sides of the same coin. The only rationale to export is because it could finance imports. If you had a friend who tells you, look, I go to work because I want money. What do I do with my money? I want to spend part of it on consumption and part of it to save. Is that reasonable? I would say yes. Okay, how do you save your money? Well, okay, I bought a safe. I have in the safe a hole, a very narrow hole in the top, charitz, and everything I save, I turn into coins of gold. And I just throw it into the safe. What did I do? I locked the safe and I threw the key to the sea. I don't want ever to open this safe. What would you say about this person? Stupid, right? What's the logic of always exporting systematically, not temporarily, always exporting more than you import as a goal? It's exactly the same. Pure stupidity. The only reason to produce something and give it to someone else is to get something in return. So yeah, I could give something today to someone else and hope to get something in the future, but say, no, I just want to give the world goods and services. I don't want anything in return. That's pure stupidity. And that's the policy that the Israeli government has, encouraged by interest groups that want to block imports and get subsidies, and encouraged by stupid politicians or populist politicians. You see, this is before the state of Israel was established. Again, it says, buy the Israeli product, the Israeli banana, not the Israeli, sorry, the Hebrew banana. It's before the state of Israel. It's from the 30s. The foreign banana that is pushed into the Hebrew market is destroying the economy, the Israeli economy. And look at the data. Imports and export of Israel, over 50 years, they moved together. So despite the huge efforts and costly efforts of the state of Israel, of the government, to encourage exports and to reduce imports, they still move together. I'll tell you what's the mechanism in a minute, without going too much into details. But look, something really interesting, just the fact is they have to move together for some reason. Okay, look what happened in the 90s. Within about 6-7 years, imports to Israel are doubled in a short period of time. Doubled. But then the exports start going up and they move together. So what do we learn from that? Even if I don't understand the mechanism, I just take seriously the facts. I realize that, well, maybe imports are not so bad. Because A, we enjoy the imports, it reduces the cost of living, more variety. I want to run with Adidas or Asics and not with a Megapair. And, you know, I don't want to work a month to buy a laundry machine. I want to work a week only. So it's great for consumers. But also, somehow it creates jobs because exports move with imports. So maybe it's not that bad. And maybe we could actually completely fail in encouraging exports if we do not allow more imports because they move together. And maybe we cannot export more than we import systematically in a large difference, unless the state subsidizes it heavily. What's the mechanism? Well, think of, let's think of the last few years where we actually export more than we import. What experts do? They send goods and services abroad. They get dollars. What do they do with the dollars? They sell them. They want shekels because they need to pay their employees. They need to take some profits, whatever, all their expenses. Now, what is the source? The basic demand, the fundamental demand for dollars comes from imports. So if we have more exports than imports, we have a market with more supply of dollars than demand. What happens to a price of something that there's more supply than demand? Goes down. And if you remember, that's the shekel becoming strong. So until recently, okay, until a year and a half ago, the shekel was very strong. What does it mean? I don't need many shekels. I don't need 4 shekels to buy $1. 3.2 was enough to buy $1. What happens when the shekel is strong? The exporters get less shekels for each dollar. So that's bad for the profits in the export industry. Who gains? The general public, because we could buy imports for cheaper. Okay, so when the Central Bank of Israel buys dollars with the intention to make the dollar more expensive, that subsidizes exporters on the account of the general public. We pay more on our cost of living. So what happens as a result? When export becomes on the margin less profitable, there's less investment in producing goods to export them. And when imports become cheaper, there's more imports. So look, what's the mechanism? If we have more exports than imports, the shekel becomes stronger. As a result, exports go down relative to the trend, and imports go up. And that's what closes the gap. And then we had exactly the opposite here in the 90s. We allow for imports. There's a lot of imports. The shekel becomes stronger. And as a result of that, people start investing more and more in the industry for exporting. I'll tell you something. You know, what's the secret of the high-tech industry? The huge success of Israel in high-tech until the recent year and a half. Okay, the huge success. What's the secret? Well, many things. I don't know the answer. I could tell you one necessary condition. Opening for imports in the 90s. If the Israeli economy would have not been opened, we cannot export a lot, and you know, high-tech industry is just exports. You cannot just say, oh, you're high-tech industry, but you're limited to the Israeli market. That doesn't work.
According to this theory, why does the central bank buy dollars?
They actually can use
Let me answer. Because I'm short on time, so that's why. I'm actually curious to hear what you have to say, but let's do it briefly, because I want to finish what I have to tell you. So there is the official answer they gave, which was, we're not trying to affect the levels, we're just trying to stabilize the system. So when we know that it's too expensive, the shekel, the dollar, we sell dollars, or we think of selling dollars, and when it's too cheap, we buy dollars. Okay, if they knew how to recognize when it's above or below the trend, so they buy cheap, they sell expensive, what would they do? Make a huge profit. What happened in reality? They made a huge loss. Okay, so that's sort of, maybe that was the intention, but they completely failed in it. And then they actually told the truth that they're trying to affect the level, because they feel they need to help the export industry. And I think it's completely wrong. I wrote about it a lot. I didn't get any good answers.
They're not stupid.
No, they're not stupid. They're not stupid.
What are the reasons?
Well, I just say there's political pressure to help the export industry. So they're politicians, even if they're not stupid. You know, being politician and being stupid is not the same thing. China only exports. Okay, and that's okay. So before this lecture, you'd think, if you just listen to the Israeli media, to people like Yechimovich, oh, so clearly when we have a rise in imports, unemployment would go up. Let's look at the data. When imports go up, actually unemployment goes down. Exactly the opposite as the Yechimovich theory. When imports go down, unemployment goes up. Okay, this is just a correlation. It's not a causal effect. But you could look at all the data, and a lot of research was done on that. The claim that blocking imports improves employment is just completely wrong. There's any evidence. It goes against logic, against economic theory. It goes against all the facts. So that's just a wrong argument. Then you could, of course, tell me maybe for other reasons we could block imports. I would disagree with you. I think there's some good answers for every claim of this type, or at least for most of it. But the main claim, let's block imports or make imports more expensive to protect the local industry, the local farming, that's just wrong. And in fact, it damages the industry. I think of the industry organization. You know, I had a lot of debate with these guys. Shraga Brosh just went to prison now, not because of the debates with me, because he was generally a liar, also when he had debates with me, but he also lied to the income tax authorities and tried to hide a few millions of shekels, so he's going to prison. I'm not happy about that. I'm not shocked. That's the only thing I'm saying. So their claim was, no, we should protect the industry. But who suffers from that? The industry, those who are on the exporting side. Same in farming. We have actually some farming products that go to exports, like dates. We're really good at producing high quality dates. But if you block imports, you could export less. So that's how things work. Okay, as consumers, who gains from imports? Everyone. But who gains more, the rich or the poor? The poor, correct. That's a paper. That's the source, published in the AR, good paper that looks at different countries and shows that systematically in the developed world, when we open to trade, we get more gains to the poor, and that's the very simple explanation. When income goes up, the share of income that we spend on food goes down. האחוז מההכנסה. The share of income that we spend on industrial goods goes down. The share of income we spend on services goes up. In other words, poor people spend their money on basic stuff, not on services. Okay? And these are the things that become cheaper when you open the economy for imports. The wealthy guys spend their money on services. What services? Going to the dentist, going to a lecture, going to the theater, going to a restaurant, drinking a coffee in a coffee shop, having private teachers for our kids, having whatever, you know, a lot of things. These things don't become cheaper, right? When we open the economy to free trade and allow imports, I cannot import a haircut, okay? It's irrelevant in my case, but just, okay, so I cannot import a cup of coffee in a coffee shop.
You can travel to New Zealand.
Okay?
You can travel to New Zealand and spend the money there.
That was a waste of our time. Seriously, no. No, but it doesn't, but opening the economy to imports doesn't allow you to travel to New Zealand. Seriously, right? Sorry, Lir, sorry. We don't have time. Okay. I'll tell you something from the book of David Friedman, actually the son of Milton Friedman. He describes nicely how do you produce cars in the US. There are two different technologies to produce cars. You could produce them in the industry in Detroit, build cars, okay? There's a completely different technology. You could grow in the fields cars. How do you grow a car? You grow wheat. What do you do with the wheat? You put it on a ship. The ship goes to the ocean. It comes back with Hondas on it. What's the difference? It's just a production process. So when you put tariffs in order to eliminate the entry of cars to the US, you protect American workers from American workers. Okay? Same. You see the general picture. Okay, we have Wednesday, so rent control would be on Wednesday, and I'll stop here. And now we have 2 minutes for any questions or comments.
So why was I wrong? If it gets cheaper to buy food from abroad, it also gets cheaper to buy a hotel in New Zealand and flight, right?
Well, okay, no, because it becomes cheaper because you allow imports. So if you tell me, no, you lived in a country in which you're not allowed to travel and now you are allowed to travel.
No, but the context is which
you're digging deeper and deeper, and it's doesn't serve you well.
Okay.
What? Don't be confused. Actually, imports become cheaper when you have more exports than imports. The imbalance is, think of the exchange rate. If you have more exports than imports, then the dollar becomes cheaper. But actually, when you open to trade, it balances. That works in the opposite direction. You open to trade, there is more imports.
Yes,
imports become more expensive.
True, but
the ones that, because the dollar is more expensive. Yeah. I'm saving you from yourself. Yeah.
Okay, this is the last question, and afterwards you can
Yeah.
carry on.
No, after this I'm driving. Guys,
Okay, so
I'll tell you
on
something, a
Wednesday.
secret. A well-known secret. 9:30, normally I go to bed. Okay, I still have to drive all the way to Tel Aviv. So last question.
You said that you don't feel like if it should be a private sector or like for some sector stuff should be private and for some it should be public. Do you have any examples for sectors that you believe that it should be more public than private?
I think the legal system, courts, maybe police, military. Yeah, I think these things are better to keep in the. I'm not sure about all the ingredients, but yeah, generally. Guys, thank you very much.